He had one job after the biggest cash robbery in American history: drive a van 15 miles and watch it get crushed. He parked it in front of a fire hydrant instead and went to get high. Samuel L. Jackson played him in Goodfellas as a background player who barely gets a scene before he's gone. The popular retellings online go the opposite direction, turning him into a fallen professional boxer who once worked in Muhammad Ali's corner, a disciplined athlete undone by cocaine. Here's the problem: that boxing story doesn't hold up. Every reliable historical source on this case describes a completely different man, not a boxer at all, but a working blues musician who played the same mob-connected bars he eventually died in. Hold on to that. This episode isn't just correcting a movie. It's correcting a myth that's already been built on top of the movie, which tells you something important about how these stories keep drifting further from the record every time somebody retells them. This is the story of Parnell Edwards, a real minor figure in one of the most infamous heists in American history, whose actual documented life is different from both the film's brief treatment of him and from the more elaborate, more tragic version that's grown up around him online since. Quick question before we start. When you hear a dramatic backstory in a true crime video, do you usually assume it's verified? Comment your answer. This one's a useful test case. Parnell Edwards was born in January 1947 in the South Bronx. Multiple independent historical accounts of the Lufthansa case describe him consistently the same way. Not a professional athlete, but a working musician, a guitar player and singer who performed in the same Queens bars, where Jimmy Burke's crew did business. By most accounts, he was genuinely well liked around the circuit he worked. A performer who'd built enough of a rapport with Vario crew associates through years of playing their bars that he became, in Henry Hill's own later account, a natural, low-friction addition when the crew needed extra hands for the Lufthansa operation. That's a meaningfully different path into a heist than a hardened criminal, being specifically recruited for his skill set. He was, in a real sense, hired because people liked him, not because anyone had confidence in his criminal competence. Here's where we need to stop and be direct with you. A popular retelling of this story that circulates online describes Edwards as a disciplined former professional boxer, training at Gleason's gym from age 15, fighting 14 professional bouts between 1969 and 1974, even doing informal security work around Muhammad Ali's training camps. It's a compelling, tragic arc. Discipline lost to addiction. It's just not corroborated anywhere in the historical record we could find. Court reporting, retrospective journalism, and the people who've spent decades researching this specific heist consistently describe a musician who drifted into crime through the nightclub circuit, not an athlete who fell from grace. One thinly sourced account does mention Edwards doing informal bodyguard work connected to Muhammad Ali at some point, which may be the seed that got exaggerated into an entire boxing career somewhere along the way. Here's why that distinction actually matters beyond simple accuracy. A story about a disciplined athlete undone by addiction carries a specific moral shape: talent squandered, structure lost, tragedy as a fall from a real height. A story about a working musician with loose mob ties and a drug habit that got him killed is a different, less dramatic shape entirely. Smaller stakes, less of a fall, more of a man who was never that far from where he ended up. Neither version makes Parnell Edwards more or less of a real person, but only one of them is actually supported by the sources. What is consistently documented? By the 1970s, Edwards was working the nightclub circuit as a musician and supplementing that income with credit card fraud and car theft. He developed a serious drug habit, using marijuana, heroin, and cocaine. According to multiple accounts of his final years, it's worth being precise about what that combination actually meant for his reliability, because it directly foreshadows what happens next in this story. A man juggling a serious multi-substance habit, credit card fraud, and car theft on top of a music career wasn't someone with a single area of focus or discipline. He was someone managing several unstable income streams simultaneously under the kind of chronic stress that habitually erodes judgment, which makes what happened with the van look less like a single random lapse and more like a predictable outcome of the life he was already living. Through the bar circuit, he became known to associates of the Lucchese crime family's Vario faction, the same crew connected to Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone. He wasn't a distant hire hoping to network his way into something bigger. Multiple accounts specifically describe him as a close personal friend of DeSimone's, which makes what eventually happened between them considerably darker than a simple business decision. It's worth sitting with what that friendship actually meant for how this story ends, because it changes the emotional shape of the murder considerably. This wasn't a stranger sent to eliminate a liability on an org chart. It was one friend, ordered to kill another, doing it anyway. Whatever code existed inside that crew, it didn't include an exception for personal history, a pattern that shows up again and again in organized crime, where loyalty is treated as useful, right up until the moment it becomes inconvenient. On December 11th, 1978, at 3:17 in the morning, 6 armed men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport and walked away with roughly $5 million in cash and close to $1 million in jewelry, the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. Edwards wasn't one of the men who went inside. His job was logistics. Drive the stolen Ford Econoline van used in the robbery to a car compactor in New Jersey immediately afterward and make sure it was destroyed before investigators could connect it to anything. It was, by every account of the case, the single most important task in the entire post-heist cleanup. Evidence disposal, not glory work, but absolutely critical. It's worth being clear about why this specific job mattered so much more than it might sound. Burke's crew had pulled off a genuinely close to flawless robbery. No shots fired, no injuries, a clean entry and exit from one of the busiest airports in the country. The van was the one remaining piece of physical evidence tying real, identifiable human beings to that building on that exact night. Destroying it wasn't cleanup. It was the difference between a perfect crime and a solvable one. He didn't do it. Instead of heading straight to New Jersey, Edwards drove the van to his girlfriend's apartment in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn. He parked it directly in front of a fire hydrant in plain view, went inside, and got high. The van sat there for roughly 2 days before police found it, towed it, and processed it forensically. Investigators lifted fingerprints from the steering wheel and door handles that matched Edwards directly, giving federal investigators their first concrete physical link to the crew behind the largest cash robbery in American history. Think about the scale of that mistake for a second. This wasn't a minor slip inside a plan with built-in redundancy. Every other piece of the Lufthansa operation had gone close to flawlessly. One unrecovered van, parked in plain sight for 2 days because a man got high instead of driving 15 more miles, became the single piece of physical evidence that outlasted the entire rest of the case. There's a detail some accounts add that's worth flagging carefully rather than either asserting or dismissing outright. A muddy shoe print recovered near the airport was reportedly matched to a pair of athletic shoes belonging to Edwards, adding a second physical link beyond the fingerprints alone. This detail appears in fewer sources than the fingerprint evidence itself, so treat it as a plausible but less independently confirmed addition to the case against him. Whatever the exact combination of evidence recovered, the underlying point stands regardless of which specific detail proves most reliable. A task built around total, immediate destruction became, through one detour and roughly 48 hours of delay, the closest thing federal investigators ever got to a physical trail leading back to the Lufthansa crew. No one was ever convicted for the robbery itself, except the original inside man. But the van, briefly before it was towed, was real, sitting evidence in a way almost nothing else connected to this case ever became. Here's a detail that gets flattened in a lot of retellings, including some that focus heavily on Jimmy Burke as the singular decision-maker behind every death connected to this case. According to multiple accounts of the internal crew hierarchy, it was Paul Vario, the Lucchese capo, whose crew Edwards and DeSimone both technically answered to, who gave the order to kill Edwards, not Burke acting unilaterally. The distinction between Burke and Vario giving the order matters for understanding how this crew's authority actually worked, beyond just getting a name right. If Burke made every kill decision personally, that's the portrait of one dominant, paranoid mastermind controlling everything. If Vario, the actual capus with formal standing in the Lucchese hierarchy, made the specific call, that's a more accurate picture of an organization with real rank structure sitting above Burke's day-to-day operational role. However violent and central Burke himself clearly was to the heist itself, whoever gave the final word, the execution fell to Tommy DeSimone, Edwards' own close friend. Roughly a week after the heist, on December 18, 1978, DeSimone went to Edwards' apartment and shot him. Accounts of the exact method vary. Some describe a small caliber silenced pistol. Others describe multiple shots from a revolver, which is a reminder that much of the granular detail in this specific case traces back to Henry Hill's later court testimony and his account in the book Wise Guy, a single primary narrative rather than independent forensic reporting. Edwards was 28 years old. His girlfriend found the body. Sit with the timeline for a second, because it's almost unbelievably fast by any standard of criminal consequence. 7 days. That's the entire span between pulling off the largest cash robbery in American history and one of its own participants being executed by his own crew for a single piece of carelessness. There was no investigation into whether he could be trusted going forward, no probation period, no second chance extended even briefly. The speed itself was the message to everyone else still in the crew. Edwards was the first of what became a long chain of deaths connected to the Lufthansa heist. Over the following months, associates connected to the robbery were killed one after another. Martin Krugman, Joe Manry, Luis and Joanna Cafora, Teresa Ferrara, and eventually Angelo Sepe himself, years later, for reasons unrelated to the heist. Tommy DeSimone, the man who killed Edwards, was himself murdered within roughly a year, reportedly by Gambino family associates, in unauthorized retaliation for an earlier killing of a made man. There's a bleak irony worth naming plainly. The man who killed his own friend over a parked van didn't outlive that friend by very long himself. In the specific crew, personal loyalty and formal rank both turned out to be far less protective than simply staying invisible, and almost nobody connected to this heist managed that for very long. Count the names again, slowly. Edwards, Krugman, Manry, both Caforas, Ferrara, Sepe, years later. DeSimone himself. That's at least 8 people connected to one robbery, dead within a handful of years. A body count that turned a spectacular, nearly flawless heist into one of the deadliest aftermaths in American organized crime history, driven almost entirely by paranoia rather than any actual outside investigative pressure closing in. It's worth stepping back from Edwards specifically to look at what this single failure reveals about the entire Lufthansa operation's actual vulnerability. Jimmy Burke built a crew capable of executing a nearly perfect armed robbery against one of the most secure cargo operations at a major international airport. What that crew could not do, apparently, was guarantee that every single participant would follow a simple instruction under the ordinary human pull of exhaustion, adrenaline, and addiction. That's a genuinely useful thing to understand about organized crime as a system beyond this one case. The popular image is one of ruthless efficiency. Every contingency planned, every loose end anticipated. The actual record of Lufthansa shows something closer to the truth of most human organizations, criminal or otherwise. The plan was excellent, and the plan still depended on fallible people executing simple tasks correctly under pressure, and at least one of them didn't. Here's what Goodfellas got right in its brief treatment of the character. Stax Edwards existed. He really was responsible for disposing of the getaway van. He really did fail at that one job, and it really did get him killed as a loose end. The film doesn't spend much time on him, but what little it shows lines up with the documented record. Here's what needs correcting. And this time, it's not really about the film at all. It's about how this story keeps getting retold online. The elaborate boxing career, the Gleason's gym training, the informal work in Muhammad Ali's camp as a disciplined athlete undone by addiction. None of that holds up against the sources that actually exist on this case. The real, well-documented Parnell Edwards was a musician with a serious drug problem and loose but real ties to organized crime, not a fallen athlete with a tragic redemption arc that never came. The redemption arc version is a better story. It just isn't the one the record supports. That's the pattern worth sitting with here, and it's a slightly different lesson than usual. Most of the time, this channel is checking a movie against the historical record. This time, the movie is actually the more restrained, more accurate version, brief and unglamorous. The embellishment happened afterward, in the retellings built specifically to make his story feel more tragic and more cinematic than the sourced facts actually support. It's worth being honest about why that kind of embellishment happens so easily in this specific genre. A true crime video needs a hook, a shape, a reason for the audience to care about a man who otherwise appears on screen for less than a minute. Musician with a drug problem and loose mob ties doesn't build the same emotional investment as disciplined athlete who trained alongside a legend before losing everything. The second version is simply better content, which is exactly why it's worth being suspicious of it, and exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to point out, regardless of which direction the exaggeration runs. Next case file is already in the works. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.